FABM program in IIM Ahmedabad, and have also served as a chair of PGP, PGPX, etc. earlier. Professor has written various books like Economic Sutra, Why I'm Paying More, a very famous book called Day-to-Day Economics. He has earned his PhD from the Ohio State University, USA. Professor Satish is a recipient of numerous awards, including a Best Professor of Economics, author of the non-fiction bestseller book, Distinguished Young Professor, etc. So we are very fortunate and we are grateful that Professor is with us in this session. We have another Professor Varadraj Bapat here with us. We have Ganesh ji. Ganesh ji is in charge of Think India. So now this session is yours, sir.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah. And we can start, sir. Please.
So let me share my, okay. Okay, so may I begin now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So thanks for this opportunity, Prateek. What I'm going to do is the following. I'll divide this talk into 3 or 4 parts. One is I'll just give you the motivation as to why I looked at ancient Indian writings on economic thought. Because I'm not a historian, but it does help to take a historical view of the economic thinking. And I'll tell you what was the motivation, why I went for this. Then I'll talk about some of the basic features that are embedded into the ancient Indian economic thought, give you some examples from, let's say, Mahabharata and few other sources. Then I'll give some examples from Kautilya itself. And once I'm done with that also, finally I'll conclude by saying, so what? It's Purana mein bahut kuch, there's so many things have been written in Puranas. So what? So is there a relevance for today's economics? So these are the 3 or 4 things I will cover in my talk now. So for the motivation part, some of you, those who are students of economics, would know that there are 2 famous books on history of economic thought. Now, one is by Eric Roll. It's also titled as History of Economic Thought, and the other one is History of Economic Analysis. Now, both these books, as a young student in undergrad college, when I read these books in the history course or economic history course, one could find references to Old Testament, New Testament, Greco-Roman literature, mercantilists, physiocrats, and of course, classical economists. But then one doesn't find any mention of Indian economic thought. And that really puzzles us. But as an undergraduate student, you learn whatever is given to you and you move on. But after decades of teaching and doing research in economics, you start wondering there must be something in our country as well. And what made me write make this presentation today, which is based on a book that I wrote recently, last year. There's an economist in US, and he wrote a book in 2016. And I'll quote a sentence from his book. He said, before Adam Smith, 6,000 years of recorded history had passed without a seminal work on the subject that dominated every waking hour of practically every human being. Now, this was a too bold a statement to say that for 6,000 years before Adam Smith, really nothing worthwhile had happened. So that's the curiosity with which I started. I said, how is it possible that India is a country of continental proportions with a 5,000-year or more history, and somebody somewhere something must have been written about economic issues. It can't be that nothing has been written. So that was the starting point. Then I looked at Indian economists, thinkers who have talked about our heritage, and I said maybe I'll find some inspiration from there. But unfortunately, the colonial period and even the post-colonial early post-colonial period, people were extremely perceptive of our own past. For example, the zeitgeist of the time was the Raj Krishna, one of the foremost economists in the early part of the India's independence, post-independence. He called India's slow growth rate, GDP slow growth rate, which was barely 3% per year, which turns out to be probably sometimes only 0.6% per capita per year, because population was also growing, very low, and he called it as Hindu rate of growth. Now, this was something, as an undergraduate student, you start wondering why it is called a Hindu rate of, well, must be something wrong with the Hindus, right? I mean, that's why one is calling it as a Hindu rate of growth. Then there was another one, Deepak Lal. He wrote a book and he called concept of Hindu equilibrium. So that means everything is quiet, nothing is moving, GDP growth rates are low, and because of the cultural background of the Hindu religion, probably he described that as a Hindu equilibrium. Now I wonder why they were using these terms, because when somebody says that I was christened on so and so date, basically you simply mean that I was named, my name was given. So that christening name is used as in a positive sense. If somebody says he is raised in very Catholic with Catholic principles, we simply mean that he was brought up with good principles. So the word Catholic corresponds to good upbringing, right? But this is asymmetric. But when you take the word Hindu, you're saying Hindu rate of growth, as if it is something negative. There is a negative connotation to it, right? There is no positive connotation to it, even if you are not using it in a religious sense. So I think that's where I thought, why is this? And I figured out that everybody thought, at least in those times, till early independence period, that Indians were more worried about otherworldly attitudes, otherworldly concerns, and therefore economic growth was not taking place. They were all interested in wealth creation, and therefore India was a third world country. As we look back with hindsight, actually Rajakrishna's term was a fig leaf for the low socialist GDP growth rate, because up until 1991, what we were following was the socialistic model. There were controls, right? You'd have heard the term license Raj. It was C. Rajagopalachari who called the early phase as the license Raj. Small scale SSI units were given some 800 products to be manufactured. They were reserved for them so that others will not produce it. On the other side, big ticket items like steel plants, coal mining, airlines were all nationalized. So those big ticket items were also in public sector, and private sector, big private sector was squeezed between these two. And not enough, as if this was not enough, as C. Rajagopalachari said, licensing started in between also. And therefore, monopolies were created. Ambassador will be produced by only one company, whoever gets that license. Premier Padmini will be produced by only one company. There will be no other cars around. So there was no competition. And this is just one example. It happened in every sector. Right? Therefore, Raj Krishna, when he said his slow growth rate, actually it was a fig leaf for the socialist GDP growth, not the Hindu rate of growth. So probably that term was not doing any charity. It was not a charitable term that was being used. In fact, you will recall that there was one Professor B.R. Shenoy. He one of the very intelligent economists India has produced, and he was the first Indian to publish a paper in QJE, which is Quarterly Journal of Economics. Very celebrated journal, and he opposed socialistic policies. In the second 5-year plan, he gave a footnote, he gave a dissent note, saying that no, we don't want socialistic planning, we should leave most of the things to the market, that's the way to go forward. But then he was hounded out to Sri Lanka. He worked for some years in Wadia College, Pune, for some years in Gujarat University here in Ahmedabad, and finally he had to go to Sri Lanka to find a job. Imagine how much tolerance was there for the capitalist ideas at that time. Let me then give, this is the background. So let me come to another story. Many of you might have read the book Discovery of India by Jawaharlal Nehru. In that Kautilya is just like any protagonist of the, he is a protagonist of the Sanskrit play Mudra Rakshas, right? This was like saying that, if you read Mahabharata, there are characters in Mahabharata. If you read Ramayana, there are characters in Ramayana. But one can always wonder whether they were really existed on this planet. So Kautilya was also a protagonist in the Sanskrit play Mudra Rakshas. So one is not sure now whether he's a historical figure or not, right? In fact, Nehru called him, now called Kautilya as India's Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli was a guy who wrote on a treatise, a very small treatise, extremely small treatise, on a continuance of the rule by the king. And what are the ways and means that with which he could continue his rule. But it so turns out that Kautilya had done much more than that. Right. So finally, what happened in 1965, one Mr. Kangle, he was a Sanskrit scholar and historian. He wrote a critical edition of Kautilya's Arthashastra, and then it was based on a manuscript which was discovered as early as in first part of the 20th century. And therefore, till that time, till the first critical edition was published, in 1965, everybody was almost saying that, well, the Arthashastra exists, Kautilya maybe he existed, but he is more associated with the Sanskrit play Mudra Rakshas. But with Kangle's book, it became obvious that no, he was a historical figure. He was a person in flesh and blood who walked on this in this land, and that was 2 millennia prior to Machiavelli. 300, where is 300 BC? And Machiavelli wrote in 17th century. So there is almost 2 millennia difference. So actually, and Kautilya talks not just about continuance of the ruler or the king. She talked about markets, administration, foreign relations, and many more things. So therefore, actually, Machiavelli should have been called Kautilya of Italy or Kautilya of Europe. So that's how the things were much different. Then I looked at Kalidas, and we all know that Meghadutam, the famous epic that he wrote, their cloud is considered as a messenger. There is I think, a cursed angel who is living on earth, who is sent to earth actually from Himalayas, from the heavens. And so he's sending message to his fiancée in the Himalayas, and he's asking the cloud that please carry my message. So therefore, the name of the Sanskrit drama is Meghadutam. In that, of course, the use of cloud is very much there. Very romantic use of cloud is there. However, very few know that the same Kalidasa, in another of his epic poems, Raghuvamsham, he compares cloud to government treasury. What he says is that, look, just like the hot sun evaporates water, converts into clouds and brings it in the following year in the form of dark clouds, which produce rain and therefore agriculture flourishes, in same manner, king taxes people and adds to his treasury, and in the following years, he spends it on public goods. Now, this was a quite mature idea that Kalidasa had thought. And given this idea, it is quite sure, I'm quite sure that if a poet writes about this, society at that time must be understanding these concepts then. So this was very much an economic concept understood in the 4th century itself, right? So these were really the reasons which made me think that there must be more to it that meets the eye. And therefore, I started looking for documents and some treatises and started reading them. And what I'll present now is some of the examples that come from this literature. Now, the basic fundamental difference between the Western thought and in the Indian subcontinent was that when economics developed in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, the idea is the standard microeconomic objective is that of self-interest. An individual is governed by self-interest, And he has a unidimensional objective of maximizing utility or satisfaction for himself or herself. If it's a firm, it is maximization of profit. If it is an individual, it's maximization of utility, right? Now, this assumption is very acute. It's not broad. It's not holistic because it is irrespective of the stage of life one is in, irrespective of the very many objectives we have in life, and irrespective of the occupation we might be in. So how does this contrast with the Indian thought? Look, before that, so therefore the standard argument, if you have utility on the vertical axis, right, and consumption on the horizontal axis, a person is trying to maximize his utility, consume as much as possible, materialistic view of world, consume as much as possible, given your income, limited income, given the positive prices, try to make, optimize and maximize your utility, right? This is the standard neoclassical microeconomic objective. What happens here is, how we are different is in the following manner. Ancient Indian tradition talks about welfare as a multidimensional construct. Welfare is guided by three fourfold facets of life. One facet is that we have purusharthas, or the four objectives of life. We have not just single objective, but we have fourfold objectives of life. Then we have four ashramas, and then we have fourfold or four kinds of professions or vocations of life. And therefore, a combination of all these are 4 times 4 times 4. There are total 64 combinations possible that a person may go through or choose to go through, right? Each one was free to choose among these 64 combinations. So welfare was a much more holistic concept rather than a single-minded maximization of utility. Let me just tell you what I exactly mean by this. Let's suppose we have this three-dimensional figure. Let's say on the vertical axis you have purusharthas, right? And yeah, there's a message saying that to annotate the shared content. During annotation, you cannot control the shared content. Well, I think let me not annotate anything at this time. I think I have enough of PPT already written down. So let me continue with this. So 4 purusharthas are there. That means 4 objectives of life are there. What are these 4 objectives? One is, why this is not working? One is dharma, one is second is artha, third is kama, and fourth is moksha. Right? So there's 4 objectives of life. Dharma means not religion, but it means righteous conduct or moral conduct. Right? So everybody has to have moral conduct. Then of course artha is required. In fact, Kautilya says that artha iva pradhan iti Kautilyaha, artha mulo dharma kama viti. That means artha is the basis on which dharma and kama and others are based. Right? So there are 3 dharma, artha, kama, and of course if you do all these 3 in balanced manner, then you might get moksha. So these are the 4 objectives of life. These objectives of life, while one is looking at, one goes through what are called as ashramas, right? So there are again 4 ashramas, and these are life stages. So you are first brahmacharya, that's where probably you will spend time studying. Then you become a grihastha. That means you start enjoying accumulation of wealth and pleasure. And then by the time you are retired, vanaprastha is the retirement stage, you have accumulated enough savings. Now you just use your savings and start leading a simple life. And finally, it is sannyasa stage, so you relinquish everything. Beyond certain stage, you just don't need anything, and that's the sannyasa stage. So these are 4 ashramas. So while you are looking for 4 objectives in life, at the same time, a person is going through these 4 stages of life, right? And while one is going through these 4 stages of life, one also notices that your objectives, they are also conditioned by what profession you are following, right? And there are 4 professions. Those who are into academics, those who are into internal security, external security, or today we can call it cyber security, right? Those who are into security business, Third, those who are in art and commerce and manufacturing. And fourth, those who are in the service sector. So therefore, one leads a life which is combination of this four aspects of life, right? So it's a much more holistic view, and if I'll call this as a welfare brick, right? So therefore, one can choose where one wants to be. For example, let's say you look at a point like A, right? Here, this will correspond to, let's say you are a Vaishya, so you are into trade and commerce or manufacturing, and you on the this side you are looking at Artha and Kama. So point like A is chosen by somebody. Maybe it's Vijay Malya for you. There could be another point like point B here. Let's say this is you have heard of Dr. Shivan, who is the chairman of ISRO. He leads such a simple life, very dharmic life, a very simple life, but at the same time, he's a family man, right? So therefore, I'm sure he earns some money, but that's not his focus. The weightage is more for what he's doing. So point B refers to a person like Dr. Shivan, who leads a simple life, focused on knowledge seeking, sending India's mission to Mars, right? So that's it. There could be a point like C. A person really has gone old, so he's in the Vanaprasthashram, like saying Gandhari and Vidur and Kunti, they all left for the Himalayas at the end of their life, right? And they are seeking moksha. So somebody could be here, and then one could be at a point like D. Let's say like Sant Gnaneshwar or some others at a very young age, or Adi Shankaracharya at a very young age, they remained brahmachari, but they were seeking knowledge, right? So somebody could be at this. So this combination of this 4 times 4, a combination of total 64 points that are there. An individual could choose where he or she wants to be. This is much more holistic approach than just saying that the individual is utility maximizer, right? So that's the fundamentally different approach that is taken in the Indian subcontinent compared to the Western world. Now, having done this, let me give you a few examples from Rigveda, from Mahabharata, and a few other scriptures, how economic thought was very much there. I'm calling this as proto-economic thought. By proto, you mean the original, right? So proto-economic thought on desires and wealth. So here is one example. In Rigveda, there is a quote, we follow our desires like cows follow one after the other. A frog looks forward to a flood. An arrowsmith seeks someone who will pay him in gold. A craftsman seeks something that is to be restored. And look at the last witty comment. A priest seeks wealth. If, I mean, even for a priest, there are desires, right? If there are no worshippers, then the priest loses his meaning, right? And therefore, priest is also looking, he also has desires. So this quote is from Rigveda, which talks about, well, everybody has some desires, and these are not just otherworldly desires. There is another quote from Mahabharata, which I will like to share with you. This quote actually is from Arjuna. Arjuna is telling Yudhishthira, when Yudhishthira was anointed as king, and you know how Yudhishthira was, or Dharmaraj, right? He said, no, I don't want this wealth. I don't want this empire. This is nothing for me. I want to lead a mendicant's life. And then Arjuna tells him, look, don't ignore wealth. Why? Because he says the following, wealth brings about accession to wealth, just like domesticated elephants are used to capture wild elephants. Religious acts, pleasures, joy, courage, wrath, learning, and sense of dignity, all these proceed from wealth. So don't ignore wealth. This is what Arjuna is clearly telling Yudhishthira. And look at this comparison. Wealth brings about accession to wealth, just like domesticated elephants are used to capture wild elephants. Imagine this is the concept we call capital begets capital, or there is a concept called sooth pe sooth, right? Or unless you have initial capital, your capital cannot grow. Capital grows on itself. If you lend it to someone, if you invest in some profit-making activity, then your capital grows. This is the idea which Arjuna is trying to convey to Yudhishthira. and how poetically he's talking about how domesticated elephants being used to capture wild elephants. So, so there are a few more I can share with you. Here is another one. Capitalism says that, most of the time markets work, but there are a few cases where markets fail, and that's we call as a market failure argument. And therefore, either government comes in or private sector has charity. The moment, there are so many schools in India which are run by trusts, and you will see a Ram Vilas Srinivas, charitable trust high school. What does that mean? Somebody has made a lot of profit, and now he's sharing that profit to start school. This is acknowledgement of the fact that left to the market, there won't be enough schools around, and therefore you need to correct this market failure. Right? So this idea is very much there in our Indian literature. In Rigveda, uh, charity, which is a voluntary act, right? And it's this is how it is described. Death comes in various ways, even to a well-fed person, and riches come to her like the rolling of a cartwheel. Hence, the rich should give alms to the poor, who become her friends in the future troubles. So, very mature idea of charity that was, or market failure in some sense, had that innate idea was very much there starting from Rigveda. Here is another one. From Gita, of course, Gita talks about three kinds of charity, right? One is sattvic, one is rajas, and one is tamas. Now, sattvic charity is one which is without expectations. And the ancient examples are King Janaka or King Raghu. They decided to give up everything and as dan, right? So, and they were not expecting anything in return. So that is called as a sattvic. And then there are others which give donation grudgingly and with expectations. So I want others to keep my, saying that, this is the person who gave the donation. If you start expecting things in return, then that's rajas. And tamas is used for wrong causes and wrong times. So I'm sure you hear once in a while, in newspapers or in on TV, that one Mr. Choksi, who has fled the country, had given a donation to certain trust in Delhi. Now, what was he first? I mean, so it's wrong causes, probably in wrong times. So that's the tamas charity that we are talking about. There's a famous example in ancient times. You might have heard the story of Vajashravas and Nachiketa. If you come to Ahmedabad and you visit Akshardham, in the evening there is a sound and light show. Actually, it's a wonderful show I have not seen anywhere in the world, which tells the story of Vajashrava and Nachiketa. So Vajashrava, he also tries to donate everything, but he's a very conceited man. He thinks that I am giving things to others in donation, right? But then he's donating cows which have gone dry. He's giving few other things which are not really very useful. And Nachiketa, his son, says he notices this. He said, "Why are you doing this?" So Vajashrava says, "No, no, these things are important to me. They are mine, but I'm giving them away." So Nachiketa says, "Is that so? So are these things really important to you? So am I not important to you? If I'm important to you as well, who are you giving me to?" And Vajeshwar was the conceited man that he was. He gets very angry that my son is talking like this. So he says, "You go to hell." That means I'm donating you to Yama, right? So now I'm not going to continue with the story. You can figure out what happened later, whether Nachiketa went to Yama and what happened later. But this is an example of tamas donation or charity. So which is for wrong purposes, wrong causes, wrong times, and with wrong purposes, right? So what we should be focusing on is charity, which is sattvic. All right. So this discussion is very much there in different treatises in ancient India. In comparison, in West Asia, charity was mandated as a religious tax. In Christianity, it is called tithe. Tithe means 1/10. So 1/10 of your profits or 1/10 of your income you are supposed to give as a religious tax. In Islam, they call it zakat. That means I think if I'm not mistaken, 2.5% of your wealth is to be given as tax. And in Jewish religion, it's called zedka. Now, all these are mandated by religion, and these are religious taxes. In Indian tradition, it's a voluntary act. Charity is a voluntary act. It's a dharmic. So your righteous conduct should tell you that I must do charity, right? It comes from your whole sense of helping others, not as a tax. Let me give you a few more examples on prices and taxation. Again, I'll go back to Rig Veda. In Rig Veda, there is a incident that is narrated that there is a customer, he's trying to buy wine, soma, from a priest as a sacrificial offering to Indra, the god. Now, customer bids very, and who is selling this? Basically, the priest is selling the offerings. So, customer bids low price, and the offering remains unsold for a mere price of 10 cows. So, customer is offering 10 cows in return for the offerings that he is going to make to the Lord. And therefore, the final statement is the needy buyer and the shrewd seller both milk out the udder, meaning they are really bargaining. So, milk out the udder. These are the similes that are appropriate for those times, for the given technology at those times, right? Basically, they were bargaining hard for a price. So, negotiation was very much mentioned in Rig Veda so many millennia ago. Another quote from Mahabharata. This is on taxation. A king should tax like bee sucking honey from a flowering plant. The tax burden should be enhanced gradually, like a person gradually increases the burden on a young bullock. Now, these are the concepts, innate understanding of concepts which modern economists talk about what is called as a Laffer curve or progressive taxation. When you're saying that tax should be collected like bees sucking honey from a flowering plant, look what's happening. The bloom of the flower is not gone. The beauty of the flower is gone despite honeybee sucking the honey. And in fact, it is leading to pollination. That means in the following season, you will have more fruits and flowers. Right? And this is what is probably happening in taxation also. Government tax people, right? And that tax revenue is used for further production or for public goods in the following years. And how much should be a taxation? You should not disturb the health of the firm. Don't tax too much. If you tax too much, then the bloom of the flower is gone. No, that's the idea is being conveyed here. And that's the idea of the Laffer curve also, or that's the idea of progressive taxation. You don't put too much burden on a young bullock immediately. Let him, get into strength, and we'll increase the load on that bullock. Let him get used to it. Similarly, infant industry argument, you don't tax new firms too much. You give some preferential treatments that firms establish themselves. So this idea is also coming through in Mahabharata. Now contrast this to what J.B. Colbert, a French economist, said. He said the art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to procure the largest quantity of feathers with the least possible amount of hissing. Now, of course, he's trying to give an impression that, well, the bird should not be, he should not be, troubled too much. But nonetheless, it is exploitative in nature. You are making that bird look filthy. You are taking all his feathers out, right? So that's not in the interest of the goose. So therefore, this comparison, this doesn't compare well at all to what the example of honeybee is. Right? So we had again a very mature worldview on taxation as well. And therefore, I come back to Kalidasa, which I mentioned in the beginning. He talks about the same thing. The state collects tax for the greater welfare of its citizens in the same way as the sun evaporates water, only to return it manifold in the form of rain. So this thought is also talking about the same thing. So in terms of negotiations, prices, taxation, our ideas were much more mature for those times. I'm talking about not just Kautilya came 2000 years ago, 2300 years ago. When I talk about Rig Veda and Mahabharata, we are going much further back in time. And for those times, These ideas are really extremely mature ideas of economic ideas. Let me give you other policies of the state in Mahabharata. We know there is a concept of revenue deficit. So a modern government says any modern government should not be borrowing simply to maintain the government. Meaning one should not borrow, a government should not borrow to pay salaries of the babus, salaries of the employees. It should not borrow for buying cars and petrol and the stationery and the regular maintenance of the government. For that, government should not be borrowing. What should government be borrowing for is for the creating capital assets like dams, roads, and education, those kind of things. Similar concept is coming through when Narada, when the, by the way, same story again, when Yudhishthira is anointed as king, Narada visits Hastinapur and he asks Yudhishthira whether or not his administrative expenses were one-fourth, one-third, or at worst, one-half of his state's income. He was clearly giving the idea that everything should not be spent on administrative expenses or your expenses. At least more than half or more should be left for other purposes. Now, this is being talked about almost more than 3,000, 5,000 years ago. Right? And then he talks about, Narada mentions that he asks if the king has constructed water tanks and lakes at periodic distances in arid regions. This is an example of public goods. He asks whether loans are given to farmers at the concessional rates. It almost sounds like chief ministers of different states talking about this. He asks questions on internal security to protect citizens and industries. He asks if he takes care of the blind, the dumb, and the lame. Now, this is a public good. Those who are not managing themselves, government should come in, welfare state, right? He asks questions in external security and mentions, and try to understand this. He mentions that war should be the last priority, for it consumes exchequer, which can be used for other public goods. And today, isn't the same thing being done by the government of India? We are trying to make sure that we avoid war with China because it's very expensive. The moment there is war, it will take away important exchequer from other developmental activities. So war could be done. We are ready for war. We are proud of nation and we'll do it if required. But that should be the last option. And that is what Narada is also telling Yudhishthira. So I think these ideas are so old and so mature. Now, given this background examples from the pre-Kautilyan period, now let me come to Kautilya and give his some glimpses of his policies. He also talks about government intervention. He talks about tanks, irrigation canals, roads, waterways. These are the typical modern examples of public goods which government must do. He talks about monopoly taxes on mineral mines. Right? The moment you give a license for somebody to excavate minerals, that becomes a monopoly right. And once you have a monopoly right, then you're going to exploit the resources. And therefore, you want to tax them more. That idea was very much there, talked about by Kautilya. He talks about leasing common property resources, which are basically forest lands and pastures. So forest lands and pastures are really the property of the state, right? So it belongs to nobody and therefore it belongs to the state. But therefore, anybody can go and graze their cattle on the forest land, right? So therefore, what happens is, so there's something called as tragedy of commons. And tragedy of commons is the following. If there's a village, right, and there is a common area around the village, which is a pasture or a forest land or a pasture land, it belongs to nobody. It belongs to, let's say, to the state, but that means it belongs to nobody. And therefore, villagers will let their sheep, goat, cows, lambs graze on that land, thinking that if nobody owns, that means I can graze as much as possible. And if that happens, that will be the tragedy of commons, because there will be overgrazing and no grass will be left in few years' time. Therefore, what should one do? The idea is what is called as enclosure movement. You enclose those common property resources, divide into smaller pieces, and then tell each householder that you can graze your animals only in a particular plot. The moment you restrict somebody to graze only in a particular plot, you enclose it, then there is a sustainable use of that property. Even though the person doesn't own the property, now he's told since you can only graze in a particular area, then he starts grazing it very sustainably. And this is what is called as leasing. So you will understand now the difference between renting a property and leasing a property. If you rent, you pay rent every month. Maybe it is for 11-month contract. Maybe you will renew the contract. But lease is generally for, let's say, 99 years. Why would lease be for 99 years? That means somebody is telling you, you don't own that property, you don't own that land, but you have to make the sustainable use of it, right? So that's the difference between rent and lease. And that is what Kautilya was talking about 2,300 years ago. He also talks about security and protection of private property. He also talks about public finance. He talks about state salaries not exceeding 25% of the total revenue. And like modern day, you have this CPC, right? The Central Pay Commission. He talked about a pay commission, and he talked about what should be the salaries for different people, starting from a palanquin holder to the Rajaguru or the Sar Senapati, or who is the general in the army. What should be the salaries of each and every employee of the state? He talks about it, and that range he gives is from 16 panas to 48 panas. So look at this range; it's almost 800 times the range is there, right? Contrast this to the central pay commissions. The minimum salary in the latest central pay commission is 18,000 rupees for a driver in the central government. And the maximum salary is 2.5 lakhs for the joint secretary or cabinet secretary. Now imagine this difference is much less compared to what Kautilya was talking about. This difference is so less that best civil servants probably will join private sector, and their salaries are 3 crores, 4 crores. So one has to justify that different pay scale will be there for different attributes, different qualities of employment. So this 18,000 2.5 lakh is too small a band that the government has come up with. This band should be much larger. Again, this somehow rings the bell of socialism, that no, everybody should get the same salary. This low band is kind of giving an impression that no, there is no incentive to work good. Why should I work more, right? If the range is so low, where is the incentive for me to work more? Compare this to a private sector. In private sector, a driver barely earns 6,000 rupees. In public sector, it is 18,000. Now you'll understand how everything is all related. Now a young man who may be uneducated, but if he somehow gets a job in the government sector as a driver, he's going to start 18,000 salary, right? So there's an incentive for bribing. Then there is an incentive for getting dowry, because I'm a employee in the central government, though I am not so educated, I'll get it. So one has to understand that pay scale has to be commensurate with the qualities of the individual, with the education of the individual, how much will be his contribution. This ratio of a 2.5 to lakhs to 18,000 is much smaller. It should have been much wider, and Kautilya had it much, much wider. So he understood the difference. A palanquin holder, for whatever reasons, he is different and a general is different. So therefore, there must be substantial incentive as we progress in the pay scales. So, he also talks about goods taxes. There are only two rates of taxes, 5% and 10%. Imagine how simplified the tax structure is. Before GST was introduced, we had so many taxes and so many tax rates. It was a labyrinth of tax rates and different taxes. Finally, we came down to one tax, which is GST, right? So the slogan was one nation, one tax. That is the indirect tax. So now, fortunately, we have one tax, which is GST. But still, there are many rates: 0%, 5%, 12%, 18%, 24%. And then on luxury item, there is a cess on additional cess on it. No, the more brackets we create, the more trouble we invite. because industry will try to make sure that they lobby hard to go into the lower bracket. Let's say they fail to lobby and go into the lower bracket, then what they'll do is they'll try to make sure tweak their products in such a way that they fall into the lower bracket. So all kinds of obfuscation starts happening. So idea of taxation is that it should be as simple as possible. I think we get some ideas of these from Kautilya. Just 5%, 10% is tax. I'll just give you one example. Let's say you go to a electrician, electrical shop. You buy a bulb, a 10 rupee bulb, right? There will be hardly any GST, maybe 0% or 5%. Then you buy a water heater. There will be another rate for that. If you buy some fancy stuff, you know, tax rate may be, because it might be a luxury item, tax rate may be even higher, even though it is a GST. Now, when somebody is paying for it at the counter, the guy has to know which product, how much tax rate, which product, how much tax rate. I mean, imagine the simple transaction cost is very high. Best thing is to have less number of tax rates also. So there should be one nation, one tax, and one rate. Hopefully, we'll get to that one rate. Imagine if there's just 10% tax, GST, 5% state, 5% central government, everywhere. I think things will be much more easier. People will be willing to pay. As a result, tax revenue might go up as well. So something to learn from Kautilya's advice. Let me talk about market facilitation. Kautilya talked about controlling weights and measures. There's a moral hazard issue. Today we go to the market, we just believe that whatever the weights that are used by a vegetable vendor, or it could be a hyper store. No, we just believe that whatever electronic weights and measures they have, or the traditional balance that is there and the weights, we believe that they are correct. But many times consumers are fooled. So therefore, market facilitation is required by controlling, having a control over weights and measures, and penalizing those who try to make some fraud. Kautilya had talked about this 3,000 years ago. There's a detailed plan of market infrastructure, just like we have APMC markets today. He talked about where should be the markets, what items should be sold where. There should be godowns, there should be warehouses. He even talks about separate structures for imported goods and the traders who come from outside. All this was thought through as a market facilitation by Kautilya. He talks about low custom duties. He just talked about 20% custom duty, and that too, if there are certain products which are locally unavailable, he was ready to waive custom duty on those as well. Right? Contrast this to today. Today we have so many custom duty rates. Of course, since 1991, we have tried to liberalize quite a bit, make it more user friendly. However, still we'll have 5%, 10%, 15%, 35%, 50%. 75%, different kinds of duty, custom duties are there. It just becomes unmanageable. And as I mentioned before, both importers, traders try to obfuscate the things in the process. So you're giving more incentives for, conducting frauds. So therefore, it's better to have less number of tax rates. And who else but Kautilya was saying this, just 20% custom duty, just one rate. Let me talk about two other interesting aspects, interest rate and rent. Now, charging interest was seen as a reward for service. What kind of service is it? Let's say I have surplus funds, I have money, and am I going to keeping it idle? Why not let somebody else make use of it, use my money, invest in something, and he also offers goods and services to the society. He earns profits and returns my money. But then when he returns my money, he has to pay the price for using the services of my surplus funds, and that is what is interest. This was well understood in India. In the West, or the West Asia, charging interest was considered as a sin. And for some reason, because of our colonial impact, we have raised some individuals like Aristotle to such a high pedestal that we never think anything bad about them. But Aristotle was the one who disapproved charging interest, and he said money is barren. How can money produce money? And this is Aristotle speaking, right? But we have held him in such a high pedestal, and we never talked about Chanakya or Kautilya till few decades ago. Cato, this is Cato the Elder, the Roman philosopher. He said charging interest is as bad as murder. Imagine this is what is being talked about by these Western philosophers, and when, in contrast, Indians were saying we understand what interest is. Kautilya said interest varies with risk and uncertainty. He had a premium on interest for traders who would use sea routes and forest routes. He talked about low duties on land routes, and he talked about very high rates for soldiers going on battle. Now you can imagine why the probability of a soldier returning hale and hearty is much less, and therefore interest charged on him was much higher. It's another matter that the king will take care of the soldiers. That's another matter. But it's a private transaction. If you want to give loan to a soldier, no, it carried very high interest rate. So there was understanding of risk associated with different uses of loan, and therefore interest rate varied with that. Now hear this, Panini, the Sanskrit grammarian, BCE, and he's talking about not just simple interest, but he talks about compound interest also. He talks about daily compounding, monthly compounding. He has different rates for names for it. And those who have studied in their state languages would recall the terms like Chakravarti Vyas. Oh, that means compounding of the interest, right? And interest was expressed in percentage terms. By the way, Greeks and Romans never expressed in interest or anything in percentage terms because they never had a decimal system in use, right? If you remember the Roman numerals, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 is like this, and 1 behind it. 5 is just this, right? And 10 is 2 5s. It is like this X. So these 1, 2, 3, 5 is this V, and 5 minus less 1 is, therefore this is 4, and 5 plus 5, this becomes 10. That is how sign language they were using. Forget about talking about decimal system and expressing interest in percent terms. So again, the point is that our understanding of economic terms was much more mature thousands of years ago. Similarly, land rents, Kautilya about being commensurate with productivity. He recognized the variation of land productivity based on rainfall, arability of land, adaptability of land to different crops, and of course population density. He also talks about lands which are at the farther end, which are near to the forest. They get ransacked by wild beasts, and therefore land rents were much lower there. So there was a good understanding of risk and land rents, productivity and land rents, and this is clearly specified by Kautilya in his treatise Arthashastra. Let me give you a few more examples. In labor market, it's unbelievable that to what extent Kautilya had thought through some of these issues. In labor market, he talks about what one could have a daily wage. So at the end of the day, you are paid like what happens in Manrega, Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. You work for a day and you get paid at the end of the day, right? Or there could be a piece rate. Whatever you earn depends on the meter is on. The more you produce, the more you get. In both kinds of schemes, what happens is quality may suffer. In daily wage scheme, workers may not produce as much because they are getting paid per day, not per piece. And if you have a piece rate, then what will happen is that shoddy work might happen because now workers are greedy, and naturally that's incentive. And they will try to produce more and more to get more money, but at the cost of quality. So therefore, what Kautilya says is offer herbal shampoos to textile women workers at the end of the work if quality is good. So this is innate understanding of the efficiency wage concept. You keep a carrot at the end. So therefore, you may pay a piece rate or a daily wage rate. However, if good work is done, if the quality is good, you give them something additional at the end of the day or at the end of the whole project. So this is understanding of efficiency wage. The Kautilya may not have talked about these things in so many formal terms, but this is what the innate idea he had in mind. He allows unions. There were unions. They were called nigamas, nikaya, or sangha, and they were elaborate laws how to hire workers from a union, and if he is discharged, what should be the rules for his payment. All that has been thought through. India, by the way, never had slavery. There was never slavery present in India, which was present in Egypt, in Rome, in Greece. And that slavery was such that for one family, 15, 20, 50 people might be, slaves might be working. Or for a city state, thousands of slaves might be working. That kind of slavery was never present in India. We had what is called as bonded labor. So let's say somebody has borrowed heavy amounts of money and he, does some fraud and therefore he is penalized. Then he had to become a bonded labor. Or if somebody has committed crime, he may become a bonded labor and he may work for somebody else. But then Kautilya talks about the right of the bonded labor to free himself by paying through his savings. So if he accumulates enough savings, after some years, if he accumulates enough, he could buy out being from the bonded state. So this was no slavery. Now contrast this to Aristotle's overt support of mass slavery. Again, Aristotle, we have raised him to such a high pedestal. Nobody knows in India that he believed in mass slavery. There are even Schumpeter in his book. He says that Aristotle said, well, what can we do? There are some people who are just not good as a race and therefore they should be slaves. Now, this is Aristotle saying, but we never hear these stories propagated more. We know only the moment somebody talks about a caste system and we are just criticized from all sides. And actually, if you go back, if you read my book, I'll mention about my book a little later, caste was never, Varna was never birth based. And I probably, you can read my book later on, this is a little aside. But then I'll come back to Aristotle. He is a man who believed in slavery. That was not there in Indian context. So labor market was much more liberal in India than in Greece or in Rome. In fact, Kautilya talks about minors cannot be used as labor. Today's modern laws talk about it. 14 years or above has to be the age to hire anybody, right? You cannot be lower than 40, any 14. That's the minors basically. And corporal punishment and dishonoring women was prohibited. And this is Kautilya stating clearly. So our laws regarding labor market were also extremely mature and liberal, which nobody has paid attention to really. All right, so I think I can give many more examples. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from others what they have said. Here is one. Spengler is an economist. He was at Ohio State University a long back. He wrote a book and he says there was more recognition of the role of price and market in some of the Indian writings than in those of Aristotle, who is viewed by some as the founder of economics. Let me give you another by Salator. In Salator in 1963, in his book, he writes, Kautilya's theory of public finance was both comprehensive and probably the world's most ancient. Now, this is quite a compliment. Again, let me come back to Spengler. Spengler says it is in the Arthashastra literature that economic discussion was most highly developed, much more fully than one finds it in classical Greek economics. So I think these are quite a good accolades, but we ourselves have not known this. And when we learn history of economic thought in economics courses in the undergraduate level, we are given the Western books, which don't mention anything about India. So somehow there is, I'm not saying, there's a concept called what is called as wiggishness. Now, I'm not talking about wiggishness. Wiggishness means that you look at your past and say everything existed then. No, that is not what we are trying to say. What we are trying to say is give the just required credit to what was thought in those times. At least that much should have happened, but that doesn't happen because we have not been given credit to our own, and that's the historical colonial past we are carrying forward. Maybe the new book should elaborate more on this. Okay, so I'll kind of wind up and probably we take questions after that. But a few takeaways from this. Again, why do we study this? Why should we look at our past? There is a famous scientist, a philosopher, who said that science without history is like man without memory, right? I mean, you exist, but if you don't have memory, you are hardly a human being, right? Similarly, if you don't know, if you are a scientist, whether social scientist or scientist, but if you don't know history about your own country and what their contributions were, no, it's like man without memory. So it's important to know. So that's what I was talking about. So no vigorousness is attempted. Idea is not to trust completeness in ancient writings, but we learn to simply should give due credit, call spade a spade, right? Let's say the Schumpeter. Schumpeter said one does profit from visiting the lumber room, provided one does not spend too much time there. Fair enough. You don't want to spend your entire life in the lumber room, but you need to pay a visit to the lumber room to learn few important things. I think this Think India session, I think if I have not taken you to the lumber room, at least I have shown you the door to the lumber room, right? You may open it and go to the lumber room for a while so that you understand things a little better. Right? Certainly, what I have presented today, Indian economic thought was not otherworldly. It was very much realistic. It was very much about making wealth. It was very much about artha, kama, and guided by dharma. Right. So four objectives of life. So it was well balanced. It was not completely looking only to the other world. In fact, there are others who say, Spengler has said, a few others have said, that had this literature been available to the West earlier, classical economics would have developed sooner than later. Right? So this is again a good compliment to the literature. I think I've talked about there being not too many taxes and tax rates, right? Which avoids market distortions and have ease of administration. I talked about this. I talked about pay commission, how variability in pay scales is much more required. Otherwise, good people will not stay in the government. Why would they stay? Either it leads to corruption or they leave the governments, right? So you have to give due respect to the qualities of individuals, and therefore pay commission should consider this, what Kautilya had talked about. And finally, an important point I'll talk about is that there has to be dharmic approach to economic life. Recent instances, our Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, has started what is called as nudging behavior. First, he did not one day just come and say, I'm going to stop subsidy on gas cylinders. No, you guys don't deserve it. You are rich people. You are higher middle class people. You don't deserve this subsidy. Such kind of policies create animosity. What he said is initially advertisements started coming in on TV and newspapers. Would you like to give up your subsidy? Some other poor person deserves it more. Why don't you give up your subsidy? That is how this idea was introduced. It was a nudging behavior. And now we all know the subsidy has gone over time. But the initiation of that was what is called as a nudging behavior. And the recent advances in economics, what is called as behavioral economics, is talking about similar things. Even Amartya Sen, he wrote a paper called Rational Fools. He said, well, we have, and he did not want to commit that in his paper. He didn't call some of the objectives as dharmic, but he said we have moral commitment. So what moral commitment he's talking about is basically what our literature has been talking about, the dharmic worldview, right? So there are certain principles you go by, and giving a gas subsidy is one of those. He talks about, and dharmic means ethical behavior in borrowing. If we are brought up in families where such dharmic values are imbibed, you will have less of Malyas, you will have less of Nirav Modis, and therefore less of such behavior in the society at a macro level as well. We talked about charity, right? Sattvic, tamas, rajas. So if you want sattvic charity, you don't want charities like Choksi is giving donations to such foundations which are not which are of questionable character also, right? So many of these things come out from this our ancient literature. I thought I'll just present to you. And thanks to Prateek and others in Think India for giving me this opportunity. I'm not a professor of marketing, professor of economics, but nonetheless, if you got interested through this topic, please look up my book, Economic Sutra. Former Director General of CSIR, Dr. Ramesh Mashelkar, has given foreword to it. One professor from Chicago, he has given a blurb on it on the back side. Dr. Vijay Kelkar, who was the finance secretary, he has also given a blurb for this book. And recently, those who might be who are from Maharashtra, who have studied in Marathi medium, we have translated this book in Marathi as well. We are calling it Arth Sutra, and for that book, the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Council, Dr. Vivek Deodhar, he has given me a blurb on this. I hope some others will come up and translate this book in other languages as well. But that's the marketing professor part of me. But it was enjoyable talking to you. I think we could take questions. If you are really interested in further economics, I have two more books. One is called Day-to-Day Economics. It talks about economic terms very in simple terms. And there is why I'm paying more, maybe a little difficult, but once you learn day-to-day economics, the other one will be easier. I think I should stop here. You should not trust a professor. Once you give him a forum, he keeps talking on and on and on. I think I'll let the mic go back to Prateek. And if there are any questions, then I can take the questions too. Thank you, Prateek.
Thank you so much, sir. Yeah, it was really an illuminating session and so much informative for us. I mean, for everyone. So I show that there are some questions in the comments. So I would request Kaushal to ask the same question which you have asked in the comment.
Yeah, let me see the comment.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. My question is that all these thoughts are brilliant for their time and they're indeed antecedents to the modern economic thought. But is there anything novel in them, like which has not been incorporated in today's ideas, today's policies, like government constructs dams, it secures private properties and all. But what is novel in them?
Yeah. So I think my very last point in my last slide, that dharmic approach to economic policies, I think that is something novel for us. And that is and I think our Prime Minister has started using such concepts. I mentioned about, giving up the subsidy, right, as a nudging behavior. It's not that many other policies, you have seen many socialistic countries where they just impose things left, right, and center, right, without taking into consideration the understanding what the consumers of different strata, how they will evaluate the policy. So you have to be your approach has to be dharmic, and which is something different in our literature. I think that certainly stands out. And it is a integrated thing. You don't study each, we are a social science. In physical sciences, you can study in isolation. If you want to produce water, yes, laboratory experiment is possible. 2 units of hydrogen, 1 unit of oxygen, boom, there is a noise and you get water. But in social science, laboratory experiments are not possible. And therefore, you cannot have a guillotine-like experiments. So for example, in China, in 1960s, there was a period called Great Leap Forward from 1965 to 1975. Mao Zedong said, we want to increase agricultural production. Some leaders complained that no, there are too many sparrows and they are eating away our grains. He had a massive policy of killing sparrows, and they killed all the birds in the farmland. And as a result, what happened? Worms population grew. Then they went after the worms. So these kind of policies, they are extreme policies imposed from the top, and this is not a dharmic approach. Inclusive policy, which looks at a multifaceted aspects of our life, that is important. So therefore, gas subsidy had to go one day. But if Prime Minister would have said, no, from tomorrow, gas subsidy is gone, imagine what kind of reaction that would have come from the society. Though some of it may will absorb easily, but many get used to it. Therefore, you have to have a different approach, a dharmic approach. And I think this is one example which was unique to our civilization compared to others. Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Ayushi, do you see the question? You okay?
Can I read quickly? If there is something, let me see if I can.
Like, is there any thought in monetary policy or like markets and indirect
Uh,
hands?
Yeah. So as far as fiscal policy is concerned, of course, we understand, right? He talked about no not having, though he did not say in those many words, but revenue deficit should not be there. That is taken care of. Public goods are taken care of. So the fiscal policy to some extent is taken care of, and interest rates and all. But for monetary policy, I think it was not that evolved at that time. To the extent what he did was he made sure that there are no counterfeit currencies, so he had laws to prevent counterfeit coins. And again, I can relate this to an example of Newton. Newton was a scientist, right? We all know. But very few know that he was also warden of the Royal Mint. That means he was the one who was producing the minted coins. And then he realized that there was widespread counterfeiting of currency, of coins in England. And you will understand economic policy, monetary policy better. Let's say if if you print too much currency, then there will be inflation because goods and services remain same in the economy. But if you print too much currency, that means too much money will be chasing too few goods, and therefore there will be inflation. Prices will rise. So he had corrected that problem by coming up with new currency, which will be difficult to counterfeit. And he also came up with a law that somebody who tells a counterfeiter, when he is caught, if he tells two more names, he'll be set scot-free. And as a result of this policy, he figured out who was the kingpin of the counterfeit currency, and he hanged him. And that guy happened to be a politician, by the way. Right now, same idea. What this Newton was talking about in 17th century, that ill effects of bad monetary policy of printing too much currency. Totally saying the same thing. He said, I will have laws to prevent counterfeit. And they were punishable offenses. These were punishable offenses. And how much a coin, a gold coin, it's not 100% gold, right? There are a certain amount of nickel in it, certain amount of brass in it. So he had identified exactly what should be the content, and those who are printing more money should be punished. So I think to some extent, if not a full-fledged monetary policy, some of the innate ideas of monetary policy of printing currency or coins, that was there, one can say. Any other things?
Sir, can I ask a question?
Yes, yes.
Good evening, sir. Nice to see you. How are you? After long.
Saurabh, hi. Very good. Nice to see you.
Yes, sir. Same here. It was a wonderful session, and it took me back to the college days, and you in your class. It was wonderful. Sir, my question is related to just now what you mentioned about the coins. We see that the first coin which came in the world around 600 BC, and it's quite interesting that why the coins came into as a medium of exchange, because we were fed up with that barter system during Mohenjo-daro and that time. So we wanted a medium of exchange, and how it's quite interesting how the coins turned that medium of exchange, gave a very structured approach of transport and as well as goods and exchange. So
Yeah.
the nature has changed over the period of time. Okay. So how do you see that the nature and the medium of exchange of goods is going to change in the next 30 to 40 years? Because we are talking in 2023, Sweden is going to be a cashless economy. Okay.
Mhm.
So how do you see that the medium of exchange is going to change over the period of time, probably in the next 30 years? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think 30 years as it is, I think certainly cash will go out of business.
Yes, sir.
Checks will go out of business. It will be only accounting entries anymore. Everybody will be, of course, every last Indian will be using internet by then, and all transactions would be, the recent advances in this Paytm or Beam application. I think what will happen is there will be only debit and credit entries in your account. Once you have a bank account, salaries keep coming, expenses keep happening, and therefore there will be no need for such currency at all. It will be only virtual currency. That's by 2030, certainly I think that will happen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right. Good. So, yeah, so Saurabh is one of our alums. So, very active student. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
We'll be in connection.
So stay in touch with him if you want to go to any part of the world. He leads. He is director of an institute and he teaches. He's a professor now at what's the institute? Your name of the institute?
Sir, Institute of Hotel Management by Taj Group of Hotels, and I also
Right.
have a travel company. So any of you who is willing to travel in Himalaya, yes, I've been asking sir for so long, and he's not coming.
No, one day I will come for Sindhu Darshan.
Certainly, sir, certainly. So we offer in Himalayas and different parts of country. So anybody who is looking for adventure
Right.
or Chardham, do let me know. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Bye now.
Anyone else for the question? I think there is one comment written. It is not a question, but I found it very interesting, and we can have one question from that. Ayushi Jain is writing that how did this such big difference come between us and Vedas? As before, it was a part of everyone's life, but nowadays, very few people even know about it. So yeah, so, sir,
It's a big question. So
of course,
the small answer is that all nations go through ups and downs, and there is a trough and zenith and nadir. So we were at our nadir for the last millennia, right? And probably we are on our swing back up. So things will, I think, things will improve from now onwards. Looks like that tipping point has probably come. But every nation goes through these cycles, and I think we are on probably on our upswing now.
So, I'm sorry, I just am I audible?
Yeah.
So I was saying I wanted to know what more dharmic policies can be employed. Like when you said that giving us the subsidies, what more do you suggest? Like
Yeah, so I think the more focus would be on building the morality of the community. So we want less of choksies. Why do choksies come up in this world? Because they are driven by greed, right? So we are not saying making wealth is bad, but going beyond, and what is that beyond? Breaking laws, doing everything possible to get to something. No, that so these ideas have to be challenged, and that will happen at community stage, and therefore. Uh, Developing communities, networks, and family upbringing. I think that is what the Dharma will be taught at that level. It's not going to be taught in going one day just before the exam, praying to the God. It's the daily affair and how you behave yourself in society, in family, in interpersonal relations. I think that's something we are missing out. And I think by dharmic economics, what we are saying is your decision should be guided by righteous conduct. And what is righteous conduct? It will come through your proper upbringing, right? And then there will be less of Nirav Modis and Choksis and God knows how many others, right? But or Dubais. Right? So I think that's the challenge. Yeah. And if we are missing that, we are missing those links. We are becoming so individualistic, right? Families are becoming unitary, not even unitary. Now only single people are living. So I think that's fabric. Building that fabric is important so that what is moral conduct comes through the family upbringing. I think that's one has to pay attention to. Somebody has talked about blockchain. Somebody has said about blockchain. Yeah, so I think blockchain, I don't know where it is going. To be very frank, it's uncharted territory. Whether it will be recognized by governments and the respective central bank, because if you have blockchain, there is a fear that governments may lose out control over the supply of currency. So, but I don't think I'll be able to say more on this at this time. It's little gray area right now.
So, the banks have some money on that they build up the money increases, right? And then there is a crash where there is a say on that.
Sorry, I think there was a lot of echo. Can you speak slowly? Maybe I'll get to.
Kaushal, you can comment. Your voice is not clear. Anyone else is there?
Avijit here. Good evening. I have a question.
Yeah.
How
Yes,
to
Abhijit.
bring the masses apart from the current education that people in rural areas have?
I again missed some of the. I could only hear people in rural areas.
Okay, let me repeat, sir.
Yeah.
So how to bring basics of economics to the
Hmm.
masses apart from the current information that the people in rural areas have, including the concept of dharmic economics that you were saying.
Right. No, so I think what happened, good question. And therefore, we translated Sunidhi Publications from Pune. They translated my book into Marathi. And I asked the same question. I said, who's going to read this? Because then he said, sir, as in India, what happens is the moment you progress in education, you start speaking only in English. And therefore you think only English can spread the knowledge. But he said, no, in the hinterlands of Maharashtra, there are people who will read only Marathi. So therefore the book must be translated into Marathi. So I think that will serve the greater purpose. My books, if they can be translated into Marathi, because my books, though they are in English, and I must admit, because I studied in Marathi medium school, my English is extremely simple. And therefore they have become popular because one can relate to. But once they are translated into regional languages as well, there is another book, Day-to-Day Economics, somebody has translated into Kannada. So I think if that happens, I think it will go to more and more people in the rural areas also.
बेटा इसमें अगर बोलना चाहे तो हाउ कम ये तो म्यूटेड वहां से है ना
Yes, is that yes, tell me.
Into Odia. So please share your email address at the end of the session so that we can discuss on that.
Sure. So what happens is because I have published this book with Penguin Random House. So the contract is such that if any request for the translation into state languages comes in, then that request has to go to the Penguin Random House, and then they negotiate with you. But fair enough, if you send email, my address is Satish, Satish, at iima.ac.in. You can get it on website also. And send me an email. I'll forward them to Penguin Random House, and some of them will come back to you.
So,
Hello.
Yeah, please.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, Suhasini ji, yes, please.
Yeah, sir. Good evening, sir. Suhasini here. Sir, I'm a student of FDP batch. It's again great listening, and I'm writing. You were started writing on this book, so it's wonderful to see this book here in the market. So my question is, you talked about the righteous thing, which our history shows us that what the Kalidasa has did and what the other scholars, or whether it is related with economics or in other area, they did so. But when we are framing our policies in this present era, we are thinking about that economic development and other things. So how or whether there is a way to imbibe all those righteous things into the system?
Good question. So I think, as I said in the earlier comment, it has to be built from micro level. It will be, of course, role models will be always there. So one thing is that there should be role models at the top, and which fortunately I think we are having good role models at the top now. So, and that can be, and therefore it permeates into the society. And at the same time, at the household level, from there, when the bringing happens, that has to happen properly within a family framework. And that will provide that moral compass as well. So it could work from both sides. From the top, it will be the salutary effect of role models, and at the micro level, proper upbringing as a family unit. And from these two ends, if you do it, then it gets reflected into policies as well. That is what I was trying to say.
Okay. So informal way only. So formally we are talking about development and how we do this, and informally.
Yes. Yeah. So true. Right. So,
Thank you.
for example, yeah. So, for example, I mean, the approach has to change. For example, I remember in my high school we had this course on Nagrik Shastra, civics. And what was told in civics, at what age one can contest local elections, at what age one can become Rashtrapati, and then wing commander is a title in Air Force, which is equivalent to what in army. These kind of questions were there in the Nagrik Shastra or the civics book. Instead, don't spit. I mean, today, Corona could have been prevented if people were not spitting, and of course, loitering. So many other. I mean, these are the small things which need to be conveyed rather than mugging up of these other things. So I think that approach also has to be changed a little bit. Okay, thank you. Thanks. All the best. Yeah.
I have my question in the chat box. Can you please look at it?
I missed out. I think Kaushal's voice is coming too echoing. It's echoing too much.
Yes, written in comment.
Let me see. Yeah, banks lend money. They multiply it because they don't really have to lend cash. This leads to a burst multiple times. What do you have to say on this? Yeah, so I think maybe when Suhasini said, what could be the implications for the policy? I think this is one implication that if we understand, as you have rightly put up there, banks create more money, right? When they get cash, they don't sit idle on it, and therefore they on lend it. Now, the greed makes you lend too much, correct? And therefore, we have something called cash reserve ratio in place, right? We have SLR, or statutory liquidity ratio, in place. So those have to be monitored well, and the innate greed, how of the CEOs or the boards, how it can go, probably it can start from, it really starts at the family level, and at the other extreme, at the policy level, you will have to control those rates properly. And for that, the top leadership has to also convey those things in those words, so that there is the sensitization happens from both ends. But good question, I think. I like that question.
Yeah, so we have time of sir.
Right.
Sir, yeah, so we are really grateful of you have. I mean, this session was really interesting and really interesting book, Economic Sutra, which I have with me. So you can go more detail in for that. So,
Right.
sir, we are thankful for giving your valuable time and delivering such a nice talk with us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah.
Best wishes to all of you. Right. Bye now.
Um,
I'll leave the meeting.
yeah, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.